Why did the laughter die the moment she stopped tying her boot? No one could explain it afterward. 1 second the room was buzzing, banter bouncing off concrete walls, confidence ricocheting between benches like loose brass. The next, something shifted, not loud, not dramatic, just a pressure change, like the air itself had decided to pay attention. She didn't look up right away. Her fingers stayed on the laces, pulling them tight with practiced precision. No wasted motion, no hurry. Black ink crawled up both arms in uneven constellations, lines too crude to be art, too deliberate to be random. They weren't pretty. That was the point. They circled her anyway. 40 recruits from every corner of the Joint Forces spectrum, Marines, Rangers, Air Force combat controllers, young, elite, convinced the hardest days of their lives were already behind them. They'd been told they were exceptional so often they'd stopped questioning it. When you believe excellence is a birthright, humility feels optional. Someone laughed. Someone else whispered. Then a voice cut louder than it needed to. Art class, huh? What happened? Tattoo gun jam. More laughter, the kind that feeds on silence. She paused just long enough. When she spoke, her voice didn't rise, didn't crack, didn't defend. You don't know what you're looking at. Not a challenge, a statement. That unsettled them more than anger would have. Garrett Thorne, Marine Raider, legacy blood, confidence sharpened by applause, leaned forward smelling blood where there was none. He tapped her shoulder like he owned the moment. Relax, sweetheart. Just curious why someone shows up to a joint ops brief looking like a prison sketchbook. The words hung there, ugly and proud. She turned just enough for him to see her profile. Calm eyes, flat expression, not offended, not afraid. She rolled her sleeve down, slow, deliberate, as if putting a weapon away before someone hurt themselves. Then the door opened. Boots hit concrete. A voice older than their arrogance cut through the room. On your feet. Everything snapped into place. Instinct over ego, attention over attitude. The evaluation began without ceremony. She was called first. No hesitation, no performance, just movement, efficient, balanced, quiet. She dragged the weighted dummy across the floor like physics had made a personal exception for her. No strain, no flair, just results. 47 seconds. Half the expected time. No one clapped, they recalculated. Then came the cognitive test. White noise at skull-splitting volume, visual interference, rotating matrices designed to break concentration under pressure. She didn't blink. Perfect score. Then the tactical scenario. She studied the screen in silence, reading terrain like a language she once spoken fluently at gunpoint. The obvious entry is a trap, she said. The ambush is staged northwest. Southeast corridor breaks sightlines. That's your real path. The instructor stared. How do you know? I've seen it before. That was all. When the commander entered, silver-haired, carved from command, he didn't need introductions. He scanned the room, then stopped when his eyes met hers. Recognition passed between them. He nodded. She returned it. The room felt smaller. Today isn't about tactics, he said. It's about what happens when everything fails. Then he said her name. And everything they thought they understood collapsed under the weight of reality. Chief Petty Officer Alexis Brennan, retired, 17 years, Naval Special Warfare, 0 casualties under her command. 0. The ink they mocked wasn't decoration. It was memory. She stood at the front without pride or apology. Let's begin. And somewhere inside Garrett Thorne, something cracked. Why would someone carve a map into their own skin? Alexis didn't pace. She didn't lecture. She let silence teach what words couldn't. When she raised her arm, the crude lines were visible again, the ones Garrett had laughed at. You called this ugly, she said. You were right. He swallowed. It was drawn with charcoal and a field knife, she continued. Third day of a hostage recovery, Colombia. No music, no embellishment, just facts. Calms down. GPS gone. A storm thick enough to erase stars. An informant shaking too hard to hold a pen, scratching a map onto cardboard because writing it down meant his family would die. We lost him first hour. She touched the ink lightly. I burned the original map. Then I remembered it, drew it here because I knew I wouldn't lose this. She spoke of mud and darkness and counting steps, of dragging wounded men through fields that smelled like rot and gasoline, of choosing paths that kept everyone alive. 3 hostages extracted, no team casualties. She lowered her arm. Pretty ink fades, these don't. No one breathed. Garrett couldn't meet her eyes. What does failure look like when survival demands perfection? She showed them another tattoo, higher, older, faded almost into scar tissue. Kurdistan, 2014. Mortar's betrayal. A vehicle flipped into a dry riverbed, a shoulder torn from its socket. 19 hours. No air support, no comms, no certainty. A teammate bleeding out. I marked fallback points with his blood. She carved the symbols into herself so she wouldn't forget where she'd failed, where she'd adapted, where someone paid for her decisions with pain they'd carry forever. I didn't earn a medal, she said. I earned a reminder. Garrett felt shame settle deeper than guilt. Shame doesn't shout, it weighs. Why is silence louder than apology? That night the barracks didn't sleep. Garrett replayed every word he'd said, every laugh, every assumption. When he apologized the next day, she didn't accept it. Words are cheap, she told him. Anyone can afford them. Then she tested him, injured him, made him the burden, and watched what his team would do. They left him behind. She failed them all. Abandonment isn't tactical, she said. It's a moral failure. This time he understood. What changes when pride finally breaks? The second run was different. Garrett gave up leadership, gave up ego, trusted someone else's clarity over his confidence. They built the drag rig. They moved together. They made it. Not fast, not pretty, but whole. Alexis watched without comment. That was enough. What does dignity look like when no one is watching? At the end, she didn't praise them, didn't absolve them. She simply said, "Remember this feeling," and walked away. Because respect isn't demanded. It isn't explained. It's earned quietly, by those who carry weight without asking anyone to notice. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why would someone deliberately hide the truth when it could silence a room forever? Alexis Brennan didn't answer the question out loud, but it lived in the space between her words as she stood at the front of the training hall, arms folded loosely, eyes calm, posture unremarkable in a way that only truly dangerous people ever manage. She let the weight settle, let the room sit with discomfort, because discomfort, she knew, was where learning actually began. 40 recruits watched her now with a different kind of attention than before. Not curiosity, not judgment, something closer to recalibration, like people realizing the map they'd been using to understand the world was wrong, and they didn't yet know what to replace it with. Garrett Thorne couldn't stop staring at her forearms. Not openly, not obviously, just enough that his eyes kept drifting there before he forced them away again. The ink no longer looked chaotic. It looked deliberate, dense with meaning he hadn't earned the context to understand. That realization burned worse than any reprimand could have. Alexis shifted her weight slightly, boots scraping softly on concrete. "You think this is about tattoos," she said. "It is." Her voice stayed level, not accusatory, not defensive, just precise. "It's about what you choose to see when you walk into a room." She let that land. Garrett felt his jaw tighten. He thought of the way he'd walked in yesterday, how fast he'd assessed threats, strengths, weaknesses, how easily he'd categorized her as something harmless, something unserious, a mistake in the environment instead of a factor in it. Alexis moved toward the projection screen but didn't turn it on yet. Most of you have been trained to look for indicators, she continued. Rank, unit patches, posture, muscle mass, confidence. You're taught to build a threat profile in seconds. Sometimes that saves your life. She paused, then added quietly, sometimes it gets people killed. The silence thickened. Garrett felt heat crawl up his neck. Not anger, recognition. You saw ink, she said, eyes briefly flicking to him, not singling him out, just acknowledging a truth already exposed. You assumed recklessness, poor judgment, maybe attention-seeking. Her gaze moved across the room. What you didn't see was restraint. She reached the table and picked up a single length of rope, worn, frayed in places. She let it dangle from her hand. This rope pulled 3 men out of a collapsed tunnel in Helmand Province. The knots were tied blind, underwater with shrapnel in my leg. She placed it back down gently. It doesn't look impressive either. No one laughed. Alexis finally turned the projector on. Grainy footage filled the wall, drone imagery of a mock village, alleys, rooftops, dead angles. This is where we start today, she said. But before we do, there's something you need to understand. She faced them fully now. I didn't tell you who I was when I walked in because it shouldn't matter. If respect only exists after credentials are announced, then it isn't respect. It's compliance. Garrett swallowed. Out there, she went on, gesturing vaguely, meaning everywhere that mattered, no one announces themselves before they act. You don't get context. You don't get backstory. You get fragments, moments, decisions made with incomplete information. She tapped the screen once. Yesterday you were given incomplete information, and you failed. The word hung heavy, but she didn't sharpen it, didn't twist the knife. You failed not because you lacked skill, she said, but because you let assumption fill the gaps where humility should have been. Garrett felt something sink into his chest, a slow, unwelcome truth. The exercise began. They were broken into mixed teams, different branches, different personalities, designed friction. Alexis watched without hovering, without intervening, standing back like someone observing an experiment whose outcome she already understood. Garrett found himself in a group with Wyatt Brenner and 2 others. As they moved through the first scenario, urban navigation under simulated comms blackout, he caught himself hesitating, second-guessing instinctual judgments he would have made without thought yesterday. It annoyed him. It scared him. He'd built his identity on decisiveness, on being right fast. Now doubt crept in, not paralyzing but slowing, making him question whether certainty without context was just arrogance wearing discipline's uniform. At one intersection, Wyatt signaled to move left. Garrett almost followed automatically, then stopped. Wait, he said, surprising himself. Wyatt looked back, irritation flashing. What? Garrett scanned the alley again, the way debris clustered unnaturally, the way shadows pooled near a doorway. He remembered Alexis's voice. Don't rush to fill gaps. Right side, he said finally, feels wrong over there. Wyatt hesitated, then nodded. They avoided a simulated ambush. It wasn't dramatic, no applause, just a quiet success that settled deep. From across the room, Alexis noticed. She said nothing. That night during a short break, Garrett found himself alone near the edge of the gravel area outside. He watched Alexis kneel, rewrapping tape around her palms with the same measured care she'd shown yesterday. The tattoos were partially visible again, but now they felt private. Not something to comment on, something to respect by not touching at all. He considered walking away. Instead, he stayed still. Alexis looked up briefly. Their eyes met. No challenge, no invitation. just acknowledgement. And in that moment, Garrett understood something that unsettled him more than her resume ever could have. She wasn't there to impress them. She was there to measure whether they were worth teaching. The realization sat heavy in his gut. Later, back in the hall, Alexis gathered them again. "Tomorrow," she said, "we test something different. No elaboration. No reassurance. Just the promise of consequence." Garrett lay awake that night longer than he'd admit. The ceiling above his bunk blurred as his thoughts replayed every assumption he'd ever made about strength, about presence, about what leadership looked like. He thought about how easily he'd equated silence with weakness, about how wrong he'd been. And somewhere in the quiet, a different kind of resolve began to take shape, not loud, not performative. Earned. He didn't know what tomorrow's test would be. But for the first time since he'd earned his trident-shaped confidence, he hoped it would cost him something. Because now, he understood the truth Alexis had been carrying all along. Some lessons don't come from being told who someone is. They come from realizing how badly you misjudged them and choosing to change anyway. Why does real pressure always arrive quietly, without warning, when you're least prepared to carry it? Morning came without ceremony. No speeches, no build-up, just boots on concrete and the low hum of fluorescent lights filling the training hall like an accusation. The recruits filed in more quietly than they had the day before. Less swagger, more awareness. The room felt smaller, like the walls had leaned in overnight. Alexis Brennan was already there. She stood near a table laid out with gear, ropes, carabiners, weighted vests, a collapsible litter, medical kits stripped to the bare essentials. Everything arranged with exacting intent. Nothing extra, nothing decorative. Garrett Thorne felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't going to be about speed, or strength, or who could shout commands loud enough to be obeyed. This was going to be about judgment. Alexis didn't look at them at first. She checked a carabiner gate, twisted it twice, let it snap shut. Only then did she speak. "Yesterday you learned how fast assumptions form," she said. "Today you'll learn how expensive they are." Commander Graves stepped forward, tablet in hand. His presence alone sharpened the air. "Teams of 4, he said. "Mixed branches, simulated hostile territory, comms down, 1 injured teammate, 5 kilometers to extraction." A pause. "Time limit, 90 minutes. Another pause, longer this time. "At 91 minutes, your injured teammate bleeds out." Garrett swallowed. Names flashed onto the screen. Team Alpha. Thorne, Brenner, Cross, Ashford. Garrett felt the ground shift under his feet. Nolan Cross, the Air Force combat controller who'd laughed the loudest. Wyatt Brenner, solid, capable, but rigid. And Kira Ashford, the quiet Navy recruit who watched more than she spoke. Alexis stepped closer. "Thorne," she said calmly. "Yes, Chief." "You're injured." She handed him an ankle brace, rigid, unforgiving. The kind that turned running into negotiation and pain into a constant background noise. "Left ankle, limited mobility." She met his eyes. "Welcome to the problem." The brace went on cold and tight. Garrett felt his pride compress with it. Outside, the course waited under a hard, indifferent sun. Hills, loose rock, water crossings, distance that looked manageable until you imagined dragging weight across it. "Go." The timer started. Wyatt took point instinctively. Nolan followed. Garrett fell behind almost immediately. 10 meters. 20. The gap widened. "I'm fine," Garrett called out, breath already burning. "Keep moving." Wyatt hesitated, then kept going. The pain sharpened. Every step sent a jolt up Garrett's leg. He gritted his teeth, refusing to vocalize it. Pride again. Stubborn and unhelpful. Kira slowed, staying between the fragments of the team. Not hovering, just present. The first creek crossing came faster than expected. Water moved hard over slick stones. Wyatt and Nolan crossed clean. Garrett stepped in and felt his balance betray him instantly. The current knocked him sideways. Cold water swallowed his breath. Hands grabbed him, Nolan cursing softly, hauling him upright. The frustration in Nolan's eyes wasn't cruelty. It was math. They climbed out soaked and slower. 30 minutes gone. At the ridge line, the extraction flag was visible in the distance, close enough to taunt them. "We won't make it," Wyatt said, checking his watch. "Not like this." Silence followed. "We leave him," Nolan said finally. Not angry, not proud, just efficient. "Set a relay, send recovery after extraction." Garrett felt the words hit before he could stop them. "Do it." Wyatt looked at him sharply. "Mission first," Garrett said. It sounded right. It sounded trained. It sounded hollow. Kira stepped forward. "No." All eyes turned. "We don't leave him," she said, calm, certain. "We adapt." Wyatt shook his head. "There's no time." "Then we change how we use it." She laid it out quickly. Drag rig, rope and carabiners, rotations, shared load, slower but continuous. Wyatt hesitated, jaw tight. "We vote," he said. "This isn't a democracy," Kira replied. Before the argument could calcify, a voice cut through. "Time." Alexis stood downslope, arms folded, watching. "Decision?" she asked. Wyatt straightened. "We leave him." Alexis nodded once. "You fail." The word landed clean. No anger, no disappointment. "You abandoned a teammate." "But we would have made extraction." "No excuses." They reset. Garrett limped back to the start with his head down. The weight wasn't just in his ankle now. It was in his chest. During the break, he approached Alexis. Apologized. She listened. Then she shook her head. "Words are cheap," she said quietly. "Show me." The second run began differently. Garrett spoke first. "Kira leads." Wyatt stared. "You're senior." "Not today." Something shifted. They built the rig. It took 5 minutes. It felt like forever. They moved. Slow, steady, together. Pain blurred Garrett's vision at times, but hands stayed on him. No one rushed ahead. No one complained. At the creek, they anchored the rope, crossed safely. At the ridge, they adjusted packing instead of arguing. The extraction flag grew closer, inch by earned inch. They made it with seconds to spare. Alexis stopped the timer. She looked at them. "Better," she said. "Not praise. Permission." Garrett collapsed onto the ground, breath ragged, ankle screaming. But something else steadied inside him, something quieter than pride. Later, as they packed up, Alexis passed him. "Remember this," she said. "The math will always tempt you to sacrifice people. Leadership is deciding when the math is wrong." She walked away. Garrett sat there long after, watching the dust settle. He finally understood. Strength was what let you move fast. It was what made you stop and choose differently when speed would cost someone everything. What happens when you succeed and realize the cost didn't disappear, it just changed shape? The next morning didn't feel like a victory. Garrett woke before the lights came on, ankles stiff, muscles sore in places he hadn't known could ache. The physical pain was manageable, familiar. What lingered was something heavier, a residue left behind by the moment he'd agreed to be left behind, and the moment he'd watched others choose differently the second time. Success hadn't erased that memory. It had sharpened it. Outside, fog clung low to the training grounds, muting sound and depth alike. Distances felt uncertain. Shapes blurred at the edges. It was the kind of environment where confidence could get you hurt and patience might keep you alive. Alexis stood alone near the perimeter, watching the fog roll across the terrain as if it were an old adversary she respected but didn't fear. She didn't acknowledge the recruits as they assembled. She didn't need to. Their attention had already settled on her without instruction. Commander Graves spoke briefly. Today's evaluation is unscripted. That alone tightened shoulders. No time limits, he added. No clear objectives, you will be observed. He stepped back. Alexis turned. Some of you think yesterday was about teamwork, she said. It was. She walked slowly, boots crunching softly on gravel. It was about responsibility, about who carries weight when things go wrong, and who decides which weight is acceptable to drop. Her gaze moved through the group, unhurried. Today, she continued, you won't be injured, you won't be timed. No one will tell you when you failed. She stopped. You'll have to feel it. They were divided again, new combinations. Garrett found himself with Kira and Nalan this time, plus a ranger named Hayes who hadn't spoken much since day one. They were led into the fog without explanation. At first, nothing happened. They moved cautiously, senses tuned, waiting for the trap that training had taught them always came next. Minutes stretched. No gunfire, no alarms, just terrain and silence. Garrett hated it. His instincts screamed to act, to impose order. Silence felt like accusation, like waiting for judgment. Then Nolan slowed, hand raised. Ahead, a shape resolved out of the fog. A civilian actor. Middle-aged, disheveled, hands shaking, eyes darting. Help, the man said. They took my daughter. The words cut through training like a blade through fabric. Kira stiffened. Hayes swore under his breath. This wasn't part of any drill Garrett recognized. Stay back, Nolan said automatically. The man dropped to his knees. Garrett felt the pull immediately, the urge to fix, to move fast, to be decisive. Then Alexis's voice echoed in his memory. Who decides which weight is acceptable to drop? Slow, Garrett said, we don't know. A simulated explosion went off behind them. Not close enough to injure, close enough to disrupt. Smoke filled the air, shouts echoed somewhere beyond sight. The civilian screamed. Help, hurry. The scenario fractured. Hayes moved toward the sound. Nolan pivoted to secure rear. Kira stayed frozen, eyes locked on the man in front of them. Garrett stood between all of it. Every choice was wrong. He could chase the threat. He could secure the civilian. He could freeze. He felt something inside him crack, not break but open. Hayes, he said, hold. Hayes hesitated. We stay together, Garrett said. Kira talked to him. She knelt, voice calm, steady, asking questions. The man's story shifted slightly. Inconsistencies emerged. Nolan circled, found a concealed transmitter. Trap. They disarmed it together. The fog lifted slightly as the scenario ended. Alexis emerged from the haze, expression unreadable. You didn't save the daughter, she said. Garrett nodded. There wasn't one. Maybe, Alexis replied, maybe not. She stepped closer. You chose to slow down. You chose uncertainty over impulse. She looked at Kira. You chose to engage without surrendering control. At Nolan, you chose verification over aggression. She paused. And you, she said to Garrett, chose to carry the guilt of not knowing. That one hit hardest. Later during debrief, no scores were given, no pass or fail announced. Garrett sat on a bench afterward, fog finally burned off by the sun, revealing a landscape that hadn't changed. Only his perception of it had. Alexis joined him without asking. You look tired out there, she said. I was, he admitted. Good. He frowned slightly. People think leadership is about clarity, she continued. It is. It's about standing in uncertainty without rushing to escape it. She glanced at his ankle, still hurts. Yes. She nodded, it will. They sat in silence for a while. Why stay retired? Garrett asked finally. Why come back for this? Alexis didn't answer right away. Because people keep thinking strength is loud, she said at last. And because every once in a while, someone reminds me it doesn't have to be. She stood. As she walked away, Garrett realized something that unsettled him more than any test. He didn't want to impress her anymore. He wanted to be worthy of the space she trusted him to occupy. And that, he knew, would take far longer than a single course to earn. What do you do when the test stops being about skill and starts demanding something you can't train for? The fifth day began without a briefing. No lineup, no instructions shouted across the yard, just a quiet summons one by one to the far edge of the compound where the terrain dropped into scrub and rock in memory. Garrett arrived to find the others already there, scattered, uncertain, stripped of the small comfort that came from knowing what was expected. Alexis stood apart from them. Not in front, not behind, off to the side as if she were already halfway gone. Commander Graves spoke only once. Today is voluntary. The word landed strangely. If you step forward, he continued, you accept the outcome. If you don't, there is no penalty. No one moved. Voluntary didn't mean safe. It meant personal. Alexis finally spoke. This isn't about whether you're capable, she said. It's about whether you're honest. She gestured toward the terrain ahead, sparse cover, long sightlines, wine that never quite stopped moving. Each of you will run the scenario alone. No team, no backup. You'll be given a task. She paused. And a choice. Garrett felt his pulse thicken in his ears. They were called one at a time. Some stepped forward immediately, eager to prove something. Some hesitated, then followed. A few stayed where they were, faces tight, eyes distant. No judgment was offered. None was needed. When Garrett's name came, he didn't hesitate. The scenario was simple on paper. Escort a high-value asset, an actor, unarmed, untrained, across open ground to a rendezvous point. Limited cover, simulated enemy observers, rules of engagement deliberately vague. Failure conditions, Garrett asked. Alexis met his eyes. You'll know. The asset was younger than Garrett expected, early 20s, nervous smile, hands that shook when he adjusted his gear. My name's Eli, the kid said. I'm supposed to trust you. Garrett nodded. Stay close, don't run unless I tell you. They moved. The terrain offered little forgiveness. Every step felt exposed. Garrett scanned constantly, mind racing through angles and probabilities, threat models layered over instinct. The first simulated contact came from the ridgeline. Paint rounds snapped against rock nearby. Garrett reacted fast, pulled Eli down, returned suppressive fire, clean, controlled. They moved again. Then Eli stumbled. Sorry, he whispered, embarrassed. I'm slowing you down. Garrett shook his head. You're doing fine. It was true, mostly. The second contact came closer. Crossfire this time. Eli froze. Garrett dragged him behind a shallow depression, heart hammering. The math ran instantly. Distance to rendezvous, ammunition, exposure. He could make it alone. With Eli, it would be tight. Eli looked at him, eyes wide, terrified but trying to be brave. If I don't make it, he said quietly, you still should. The words hit harder than any round. Garrett felt something old stir, training layered over memory. Missions where speed had mattered, where sacrifice had been framed as necessity, where survival had been simplified into numbers. He remembered Alexis's voice. The math will always tempt you to sacrifice people. Get up, Garrett said. They moved together. The third contact was the worst, direct, close, the kind of engagement where decisions are measured in heartbeats. Garrett took a simulated hit. His vest vibrated sharply. Hit, the evaluator called out. Garrett staggered, dropping to one knee. Eli screamed, "No, no." Garrett grabbed him. "Listen to me." He could still move, but slowly. Eli tried to pull him, failed. "Leave me," Garrett said, the words tasting bitter. "You can make it." Eli shook his head violently. "I won't." They sat there, exposed, time bleeding away. Garrett felt panic claw at the edges of his control, not fear of death, but fear of repeating something he could never undo. He made his choice. He fired a smoke canister, then another, used himself as cover, crawled, dragged, pushed Eli forward inch by inch. They crossed the line together. Barely. When the scenario ended, Garrett collapsed, chest heaving, hands shaking. Alexis approached slowly. "You failed the timing window," she said. Garrett nodded. "Yes." "You took unnecessary risk." "Yes." She waited. "But you didn't abandon him," she finished. Garrett looked up at her. She studied him for a long moment, then turned to Eli. "You okay?" Eli nodded, eyes bright. "He didn't let me go." Alexis dismissed him gently. Then she sat beside Garrett on the ground. "Do you know why this one's voluntary?" she asked. He shook his head. "Because some lesson, reopen doors people have spent years trying to close." Garrett swallowed. "Did you ever?" "Yes," she said quietly. "I left someone behind once." The admission landed, heavier than any story she'd told before. "I told myself it was necessary," she continued, "that the mission demanded it. The math supported me." She looked out at the terrain, eyes distant. "The math still does." Garrett didn't interrupt. "But I live with the remainder," she said, "every day." Silence stretched between them, not awkward, not heavy, honest. "This course isn't about redemption," Alexis said at last. "It's about awareness. You don't get to choose whether your decisions haunt you, only whether they deserve to." Garrett nodded slowly. As the sun dipped low, the others returned from their runs, some quiet, some shaken, some relieved. No rankings were posted. No scores given. Alexis addressed them one final time that evening. "Strength isn't what you're willing to do," she said. "It's what you're willing to carry afterward." She dismissed them. That night Garrett lay awake again, but this time not from restlessness. From clarity. He understood now that leadership wasn't about avoiding guilt. It was about choosing the kind you could live with, and never pretending it didn't matter. Why does the quiet after everything is over feel heavier than the moments that nearly broke you? The last day arrived without announcement. No horns, no assembly call, just a sense of finality that settled over the compound like dust after a long convoy passed through. People moved differently, slower, more deliberate, as if rushing now would be a kind of disrespect. Garrett packed his gear in silence. The ankle brace lay folded in his bag, no longer needed but impossible to ignore. He paused before zipping the bag closed, fingers resting on the worn fabric, remembering the weight of being dragged and the weight of being chosen. Outside, the recruits gathered naturally, not because they were told to, but because separation felt wrong. Alexis stood near the edge of the training ground again, same place she always seemed to end up, watching, waiting, not for them to impress her but for something quieter to reveal itself. Commander Graves spoke briefly. "This is the end of the course." No applause followed. "There will be no final exercise," he continued. "No evaluations, no commendations." A few heads lifted in surprise. Alexis stepped forward. "Some of you expected closure," she said. "A final test, a moment that proves you changed." She shook her head gently. "That isn't how it works." She walked slowly in front of them, eyes meeting faces she now knew well, faces that carried less certainty and more depth than when they'd arrived. "You don't graduate from this," she said. "You carry it." Garrett felt the truth of that settle into him, not like a weight, like a responsibility that fit. Alexis stopped in front of him. Thorne. Yes, Chief. She studied him for a long moment. The pause wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt earned. You came here believing leadership meant being right, she said. Fast, loud, unquestioned. Garrett didn't flinch. You're leaving knowing it means being accountable, she continued. Slow when needed, quiet when required, willing to stand where others won't. She nodded once. That's growth. It wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement. She moved on. To Kira, to Nalan, to others whose names carried different lessons now. She didn't single anyone out for heroism. She didn't need to. What mattered had already taken root. Finally, she stopped where everyone could see her. I won't tell you what kind of leaders you'll be, Alexis said. That's not mine to decide. She glanced at the horizon where the land stretched open and indifferent. But I'll tell you this. She faced them again. You will be tempted to confuse efficiency with morality, results with righteousness, survival with success. Her voice stayed calm, steady. When that happens, remember how easy it was to leave someone behind. Remember how reasonable it sounded. Garrett felt the words strike deep, echoing his own voice from days earlier. And remember, she finished, that every shortcut charges interest. Silence followed. Then Commander Graves dismissed them. People began to move. Handshakes, quiet nods, no celebration, just recognition passing between those who'd shared something that couldn't be explained to anyone who hadn't been there. Garrett lingered. Alexis noticed. You don't need to say it, she said before he could speak. I know, he replied, and he did. They stood together for a moment, watching others drift away, carrying pieces of the course with them into futures that would test those pieces in ways training never could. Will we see you again? Garrett asked. Alexis shrugged slightly, probably not. He nodded. That's okay, she added. You're not supposed to. She turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. Garrett waited. The ink, she said, glancing at her forearm. One day you might understand why I stopped adding to it. He thought for a moment, because the lessons changed. She smiled faintly, not at him, at the memory. Because eventually, she said, you stop needing reminders carved into your skin. They live somewhere deeper. She walked away. Garrett watched until she disappeared beyond the perimeter, then picked up his bag and headed toward the gate. The world beyond waited, loud, fast, certain it already knew how things worked. He stepped into it differently than he'd arrived. Not lighter, stronger in a quieter way. He understood now that leadership wasn't about standing at the center of attention or silencing doubt with confidence. It was about standing with people when doubt refused to go away, about choosing to carry weight instead of shedding it when no one was watching. Somewhere ahead, there would be moments when the math made sense and the choice felt clean. And moments when it didn't. When those moments came, he knew what he'd remember. Not the tests, not the pain, but the decision to stay. Because sometimes dignity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear rank or raise its voice. Sometimes dignity simply acts and accepts the cost without asking to be seen.